Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder, and today I am talking with Josh Lewis from the Saving Elephants podcast. And in this moment, I have my Saving Elephants podcast mug. And if you know me, well, I don't know. You may or may not know this about me. I actually love elephants. I think because I have a yoga background, which stems from India, which is deeply rooted in Hindu tradition. And in that tradition, the elephant is a sacred animal who represents the deity Ganesha. And Ganesha is the lord of obstacles. Sometimes people refer to Ganesha as the remover of obstacles, which for sure that energy can be that. But also sometimes Ganesha will place obstacles in your path in order to get you to stop and think, or in order to get you to go another way or turn in another direction. In any case, this is not a podcast about Hinduism. Also, this is not a podcast about environmentalism, which you might think by the name. Nope. This is a coffee mug that is white with red and blue lettering, and an elephant with the stars and stripes. Oh, this is a political podcast about conservatism. And if you know me, you know that I would not classify myself politically as a conservative. And so you might be thinking, well, Andrea, why on earth are you promoting a podcast about conservatism? Just hear me out. Or actually, hear Josh out, because I really like what he has to say. And though we didn't really get into a political debate in this episode, sorry if that's what you were hoping for, but this is a podcast about podcasting, not about politics. But I do really like his approach and his reason for wanting to start a podcast in the first place. And so we'll get to that in just a moment. I do want to encourage you to check it out, especially if you would not consider yourself to be conservative politically, because, well, I've been trying this thing where I consume content about topics which I would not normally want to consume information about, and also where I consume content by people that I would not normally consume content by. Not because I dislike them, but because it just wouldn't be on my radar, or wouldn't be on the top of my list. And so it's been a really fun exercise getting to know Josh and getting to know the Saving Elephants podcast. But before we get to Josh, quick announcement. If you are a podcaster, or rather, if you are an aspiring podcaster in the Chicagoland area, I am offering a free Podcast Envy class. Launch your own podcast at Nextdoor Chicago coming up, if you're listening to this in real time, Wednesday, August 29th in the evening at Nextdoor Chicago. You can learn more about that on my Facebook page, which is andreaklunder.creative, which you can link to in the show notes for this episode, or at nextdoorchicago.com. And if you are an aspiring podcaster who is not in the Chicagoland area and it makes you sad because you cannot come to my free class, never fear. I have a plan for you. All you have to do is get on the Podcast Envy email list, and you will soon have the opportunity to sign up for a free webinar, also called Launch Your Own Podcast. But A, you have to be on the list to find out about it, and B, you have to tell me you want it, because I really hate this thing as a content creator where you make stuff that you think people want and then they don't actually want it, and then you feel like you wasted a whole bunch of time. I'm not doing that. So if you want the free Launch Your Own Podcast class, you have to get on the Podcast Envy mailing list. And here is how you do that. Go to The Creative Impostor, that's my studio name, thecreativeimpostor.com/5 questions. That's thecreativeimpostor.com/5 questions. And there you can put your email. And you will get something really amazing from me already, which is 5 questions you haven't asked about your podcast. So actually, even if you don't want this silly free webinar and you already have launched your show and you already are a podcaster, you should still go there and you should still get that thing, because I bet that some of the questions on that list you haven't asked about your podcast yet, and they will help you. I promise. thecreativeimpostor.com/5 questions. And there you will get 5 questions you haven't asked about your podcast. You will get on the Podcast Envy VIP email list, and you can reply to the email that you'll get from me and ask me for the free Launch Your Own Podcast webinar. If I get a few requests, I will make it so. All right, without any further ado, here is Josh Lewis, Saving Elephants Podcast. Josh Lewis of Saving Elephants Podcast, thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Envy today.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about why you podcast.
Well, I podcast for 2 reasons, really. One is I feel like I have a message that's important to me, and I'm trying to do anything I can to get it out. It began as a blog, and I've been podcasting for ever since April to reach a wider audience, my audience being millennials. And I guess you could say I'm betting on what I believe to be the long-term likely outcome of our political climate here in the United States. That being that I suspect many years from now, both the left and the right are going to look back at this era with a great deal of shame at the level of vitriol and hatred we've been exhibiting toward each other. And so I'm trying to do my part to elevate the conversation back to basics, why we believe certain things. It's a partisan podcast. I definitely have beliefs. I'm definitely presented from a biased point of view, but I'm trying to present information in such a way that engages ideas and doesn't attack individuals. That's really my primary reason, but I had a second reason, which is my girlfriend has a chronic illness, and it's created a situation in our lives where I have to spend most of my time here at the house. And so most of my passions have had to be redirected in that area where I'm having to find ways to bloom where I'm planted here at the house, doing things from home. And podcasting is an incredible resource for someone who's looking to make a difference, but perhaps doesn't have the ability to get out into the world as they'd like.
Okay, so I need to confess to my listeners that when I reached out in a couple of podcasting groups and said that I was looking for podcasters who wanted to come on the show and talk about imposter syndrome in podcasting, I had so many responses, actually like way more responses than I ever anticipated I would get. And I was kind of sorting through all the different people who responded, looking at their show, checking out their links and things like that. And I think this probably happens to you a lot. I was like, Saving Elephants, oh, this must be like an environmental show or something.
Right.
Coming from my liberal bias, I'm like, oh, environmentalism, right? And then I saw your cover art. I'm like, oh, no, this is political. And even though I don't think I'm as engaged politically probably as you are, but I do obviously have like strong biases and opinions. And I, had this immediate like, I don't want to have a conservative political podcaster on my show. And I almost wrote it off, right? And then there was something that was like, no, let me check this out. Actually, let me look a little further. And I really liked a lot of what you said about how you're framing your show, how it's not about punditry. It's not about necessarily current events, but it's motivated by your frustration in the current political climate. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And I should probably say there at the beginning, you're correct that we are often mistaken for individuals trying to save elephants. And, I say I am completely supportive of that movement, but that's not the particular elephant I'm focused on.
Right.
And no, what you said, I think, puts it very well. I like to think that I have a lot of friends who are on the, if we could term it this way, the political left. And it strikes me that ever since the 2016 election, I've almost had more productive conversations with some of them. And then it seems like some of the others, both on the left and right, have somewhat retreated to what I think the cliche way of saying it these days is our political silos. Mm-hmm. And it seems like it's opened up this unique opportunity for communication on both ends, for individuals to say, no, wait a minute, it looks as if perhaps things are getting a little out of hand with this sticking my fingers in my ears, refusing to engage with the other side. And again, the purpose of engaging with the other side is not that you believe yourself to be just completely open-minded to where you accept anything as truthful, but rather you look at the other side not as an enemy to be defeated, but as fellow Americans to be persuaded. You believe that your cause is just and right and that you share common values and you're trying to engage with one another. And honestly, that's a conversation that's sorely needed in this climate.
Instead of just this kind of blanket division, us-them mentality and left-right mentality. And, even if you wanted to take it into current politics and have Clinton-Trump mentality, which, and I think I said this to you too, that to be quite honest, I found myself in a similar situation that you mentioned being is that you are definitely more right-oriented, you're definitely more conservative, and still didn't fully support Trump as the presidential candidate. And I was also over here on my camp saying, I don't love Hillary Clinton as a candidate. And of course, being female and on the left, and people are like, how can you not support our first, potential female president? And it's like, well, there's more to that than just being female. And there are qualities about her that I do like. And then there are things that are concerning for me. And so it leaves you kind of in this no man's land of, but I now am compelled to vote for something that is not 100% what I would wish.
Right. And that word support you use there, that is such a powerful word. And we do this all the time in politics. We use a word that carries with it enormous connotations, but we don't take the time to examine, what am I actually saying? And what you've expressed perhaps on the left with some of your female friends, well, how dare you not support the female candidate? Obviously, that's experienced on the right too. How could I not support Trump? And there was a time when, again, I argue from a conservative perspective, there was a time when conservatism was well understood to be a worldview that supported ideas. It never supported an individual. No one human embodied what it meant to be a conservative. And so if someone, you could think of President Ronald Reagan, for example, is usually held up on some pedestal as the ideal conservative. And he did in a lot of ways defend a conservative perspective, but that in no way meant that everything he did was an absolute perfection. And I think we wind up in this trap where we're encouraged to either hate or almost unreasonably love and bow down to the archetypes of our movements, if you will. Mm-hmm. When in reality, what we should be focused on are ideas, are ways to engage each other, are things that make sense, not the humans themselves, but the ideas. And then we determine, well, who do we support based on these issues, based on these ideas?
That makes a lot of sense. So you're a fairly new podcaster. How many episodes do you have out right now?
Let me think here. If you don't include a couple of shorter bonus episodes, I think I recently released number 9 on Tuesday. And I'm really stoked about that because I read in a couple of sources that after you're past the 8th episode, I think, that you've made it to the elite 10% of podcasters. I mean, seriously doesn't feel like I'm in that elite group, but apparently that was a fairly easy threshold to pass. And so
yeah, that's a loose statistic that I kind of throw around with my podcast coaching sessions and clients and in workshops that I teach, public workshops that I teach, where it's either 7 or 8 is sort of the number that I typically hear. Like, if you can make it past 7, you're good. Because it's like the first 7 episodes, or you get to 7 and then people sometimes freak out because they realize, oh, this is a lot more work than I thought it was going to be, or, oh, this takes more time than I expected, or, oh, I've been putting in all this work and all this effort, and I've created these 7 episodes that I'm really passionate about, and I only have 50 people downloading my show. Like, where are the masses? That kind of thing. And so it can get frustrating.
And I did have a couple of advantages that I'm not sure that everyone who tries to launch a podcast perhaps has. The first of which is I was under no delusion I would make any money off of this. Mm-hmm. I mean, I suppose it's possible many years hence, and I know that, the nature of certain podcasts, that's not what they're in it for. If they're trying to expand a business, I get that they're trying to make a profit as quickly as possible. But I think that immediately allowed me to focus on something other than those things that could perhaps expand a profit base. But, the other advantage is, politically speaking, as I mentioned, I've been blogging before this. Gosh, I was used to having a largely unengaged audience for quite a while. I know that in the political realm, they usually only show up during election years. And unfortunately, because this is the complete opposite of the sort of conversation I'm trying to stoke, it tends to be you can get people engaged if you can get them outraged about something. But it's really hard. You have to play the long game, which I'm in this for the long game. It's really hard to get people to truly stop and think about something.
And so what was it about podcasting? And I know that you said your situation of spending more time at home to be with your girlfriend and to be a support there was one of the reasons why you got into podcasting. But what was it about the medium of podcasting that you wanted to take the blog up a notch and put it into this format? Like, what was attractive about that to you?
Oh, gosh. I mean, there's so many different things that come to mind. I think what perhaps endeared me to podcasting before I even contemplated doing one of my own was that I've always had a strong relationship with audio itself. And I'm not going to get too far off into the weeds here, but my background is I grew up in a very extraordinarily conservative, here I don't mean in a political sense, but conservative traditional Free Holiness church here in Oklahoma. And what I mean by that is we didn't go to movie theaters. We didn't have a TV. our source of entertainment was the radio. And specifically, we'd listen to old cassettes of the old 1940s and 30s radio broadcasts. So when I was coming of age politically through the 90s, I got my political start, if you'll forgive me here. I owe a debt to Rush Limbaugh for getting me interested in politics in the first place, though I'm very grateful I've moved on from, shall we say, a shock talk political punditry radio since then. But I've always had this fascination because I think as much as I enjoy watching film, short YouTube clips, and I think there's a great value there, I just think there's a different way at which when you're in someone's ear, you interact with them at a much more personable level. And I think they're much more receptive to hearing what it is you're trying to say. You're not necessarily just there to entertain them. They're wanting to grow in some way. And as great as blogging is, I mean, podcasting is in a lot of ways the hip thing. You can listen to it while you're mowing the yard or doing dishes or driving somewhere. I mean, how many of us are stuck in traffic and, just tired of listening to the same old songs over and over on our favorite stations? It's just a powerful way to get a message out, is to communicate to someone on that very personal level.
Oh, it's that podcast angel time. And today, my podcast angel is me. And I want to tell you about podcast envy. If you listened to the beginning of the show and you did not skip the intro, then you know that I am offering a free Podcast Envy Launch Your Own Podcast class in Chicago coming up Wednesday, August 29th at Next Door Chicago. And if you have already taken that class, or you've already done a bunch of research, and you really want to launch your show, but you're just still dragging your feet, it's still a little overwhelming or confusing, or you just don't have time to do all the things, or you need help, I have another solution for you, which is my Podcast Envy VIP service. We will take you from wherever you are in the process right now to first 3 episodes of your show launched VIP style. Want to learn more? Go to podcastenvy.com, click the link, and we will set up a virtual tea date to talk about how you can launch your show VIP with Podcast Envy. That's podcastenvy.com. I'd love to help you get launched. So, talking about being a new podcaster and sharing this message and coming to it from this point of passion and interest for you, when you thought about the idea of imposter syndrome, or when you saw my post, what came up for you? Why was that a resonant topic for you?
It's not just any one thing. I really think that deep down, all of us can kind of relate to this notion that in some ways, I am a phony. I'm inadequate, I'm insignificant, or I'm an imposter in some ways. And I think at a very deep level, when you try to do what I'm trying to do, a show about persuasion, right? I'm trying to say, here's an idea I have that I believe you should have this too. There is a lot of an opportunity for a great sense of insecurity to enter into that. And to me, imposter syndrome is not something that is stable. I might be talking to you right now and feel extraordinarily confident, and then you may say something to the effect, okay, the interview is going to go out on this day, and I don't even want to listen to it because I feel, I hate the sound of my own voice, and I'll probably make some stupid claim I could have made better. I can think back to those first couple of episodes I've done. I doubt I've improved that much since, but when I listen to it, I'm okay with the tone of my voice. I'm just not okay with the delivery. I feel like I'm preachy, or I'm sort of reading from a script, or not natural. And I'm afraid sometimes that's a bit of a turnoff. And so I think for me, an imposter syndrome is that I feel like I have an important message, but I'm scared that some inefficiency in me or some lack of quality in me is going to distort that message, and it's going to be counterproductive.
I think that's so fascinating. I think you're the first person that I've talked to frame it in exactly that way. It sounds like it's less so a fear of how you are going to be perceived, and more so a fear of doing your message, which you believe to be so important, an injustice or a disservice through your inadequacy.
Yeah, some of that could be personality based, in that I greatly value purpose and meaning. And so for me to feel like I'm pursuing a life of purpose and I'm trying to encourage others to do so also, if I fail at that task, for me, that ignites my fear that I'm an imposter or that I'm insufficient.
And so what do you do to keep yourself moving forward, to keep yourself from deleting those first couple episodes?
I knew that question would likely come up in the interview, and I really wished I could have, well, here are the 3 things that I recommend. And I don't. I really don't. And I can tell you what has helped throughout my life, but it's probably not a very cheery message, which is that unfortunately, sometimes you just have to do it. And you have to be totally okay with failing. I will say this, my profession, politics is, I don't want to call it a hobby because it's something I think is purposeful and has meaning. But what I do for a living is I'm an auditor. I'm a CPA. I used to work in public accounting and now I work for the state of Oklahoma. But in the auditing profession, it really is a sink or swim profession. And there's no easy way to teach auditing to someone else. You just sort of have to let them go out there and flounder about. And you are encouraged and you're taught very strongly to basically fake knowing things. And I don't mean lie to people. You don't fake knowing facts, but rather you want to portray an aura of you have it all together, even though deep down inside, you're not entirely certain what the answer is. So you want to say things such as, I don't know for certain. I'll get back to you on that, or it's a very good question. You want to allow for adequate time to learn yourself and to grow. But where I'm going with all this is I think that experience for me of constantly being out there, being in front of, CFOs or vice presidents, some young whippersnapper just straight out of college who just recently earned a CPA trying to act like he actually was going to advise these people as to how to better run their company. That's a very awkward position to be in. And you have to develop that skill set of being okay with the awkwardness. It does get better, but I don't think there's ever going to be a day in which I've completely got this made. And I will say, too, added to that, because you asked, what do you do?
Yeah.
You got to know your stuff. It's this combination of being totally okay with knowing I'm going to feel like an imposter. I'm going to be doubting my own abilities, but you've got to take time to do the research. And podcasts like mine, we're trying to argue from a certain viewpoint. I do a lot of reading. And I had the advantage of doing a blogging before this. So sometimes just writing about things helps you kind of flesh out ideas. You've got to develop a habit of learning. And just developing that habit doesn't get rid of the imposter syndrome. But I think over a long period of time, you begin to notice, I actually am not giving terrible advice. I actually do seem to know what I'm talking about in these places. And I think that kind of repetitive falling on your face and then getting back up, falling on your face, I think it gets easier and easier. But it's a combination of learning and then just doing.
Yeah, I think that there's two things. Definitely knowing your stuff is very important. And also knowing that it's okay that you don't know everything. And I think that I experienced that as well when I started coaching podcasters and offering training and services. I felt like I needed to be able to answer every question. If someone asked me, well, how do I do this thing in GarageBand, which is a software that I don't use? I have access to on my computer, but I just don't use that software. I felt like I needed to know the answer about this particular software thing because podcasters do use it. And so since podcasters, this grand category of podcasters do use this software, if I'm going to coach people, I need to be able to answer their questions. And then I realized, wow, I am just getting way too specific. There's no way that I am expected to know every single detail and every single nuance of every single possible podcasting situation that could possibly be out there. And it's okay to not know, but it's also good to know what you do know. And that if push comes to shove, you have the capacity to find the answer to something for someone, or where the resources are. And so there's kind of that fine line between making sure that you know enough versus trying to know everything.
Right. And I might say, too, because it just came to me that you asked what advice, perhaps, or what habits I key into. There are two things that came to mind. Probably the best advice I got when I began blogging, and I think this definitely carries over to podcasting, was from a professional writer who was talking about the writing he does. And he says, I hate writing, which is kind of shocking coming from someone who chooses that as their profession, right? But he says, but I enjoy having written something. And related to that, back in the day when I was taking piano lessons, I think perhaps some of the best advice I got as far as practicing goes, because we've all heard the phrase that practice makes perfect. My piano teacher said that practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. And if I wed this idea together of I hate writing, but I enjoy having written something, and practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. I think what I take from that is this idea that practice, or in my case, reading, preparing, studying, it's okay if that's not a particularly enjoyable discipline. The point of that is not that I'm supposed to enjoy this. In fact, there's a sense if you could visualize this mental image of someone kind of sweating by their brow and exerting some effort. We want to be careful that when we're, here I'm using air quotes, practicing, that we're doing so very intentionally and with a great deal of effort and with a great deal of focus, because we don't want to be wasting a lot of time practicing and we're just not really getting any better. I mean, it might be more enjoyable, but in the end, we might enjoy writing in that instance, but we're not really going to be as happy with what we had written. And I think the same is true for podcasting. You need to be careful that if you're taking the time to get better at this imposter syndrome, right? If you're doing a podcast about a particular subject matter and you're going to learn more about it, really learn more about it. Don't waste your time just sort of skimming the surface and then having nothing of value to offer. I think you'll be burnt out after a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you see progress, I think just human nature is to want progress, right? You want to see that your effort is amounting to something. And if you just keep doing something over and over again and it's not improving or changing or growing or something like that, eventually, yeah, it's going to be like, why am I doing this again?
Right.
All right. So, Josh, I have some short answer questions for you that I've been asking every guest that I have on this mini series about imposter syndrome. And these are related specifically to podcasting, because I thought these are questions that I get asked a lot. And I thought, well, it would be good to have some different perspectives and some different resources on some of these. So first thing, Saving Elephants. How did you come up with that for your podcast title?
Well, that was actually farmed around for a while. The idea for Saving Elephants emerged after the 2016 election. And I had been involved in the Republican Party because I recognized that if I showed up to, say, someone's group, I could lower the median age by a good 10 years. There's not too much youth in the Republican Party. So after 2016, it occurred to me, we have a major demographic problem on the horizon. And furthermore, it seems like the definition of conservatism is waning or getting more and more watered down. So Saving Elephants kind of developed this whole nation of trying to resuscitate the GOP back to a message of inclusion for a larger group of individuals while still remaining true to a conservative worldview.
And then where did you get, find, make, etc., the cover art for your show?
I have the good fortune of the girlfriend I mentioned with a chronic condition. She is a mind-blowingly talented artist, and she can do just about anything. And since I take care of her, she's graciously agreed to provide some really stellar artwork from time to time.
Awesome. The jazzy theme music that you use on the show, where did that come from?
Honestly, I just went to one of those websites where you can purchase a theme song.
Uh-huh.
I can't remember the name of it, but I'm kind of anal, so I decided on jazz, and then I listened to it for hours and hours, different theme music, and it narrowed down to 5 and kind of workshop it around some friends. And
yeah.
No magic there, just a lot of trial and error.
Music, I feel like, is one of those rabbit holes when I'm working with a new client. It can very easily devolve into hours and hours and hours of listening to things over and over and over again until you wear yourself down and you're like, fine, it's fine. This is fine.
Right.
But I think it works really well. I like your music a lot.
I think it does for what I'm trying to do. In fact, I'll say this. I listen to a lot of other actual political punditry podcasts, and it seems like they all borrow the same sort of headbanger, adrenaline pumping music. And it occurred to me, I'm not really trying to hype someone up. I'm trying to get them to think. And I just like the idea of a jazzy theme where you're more relaxed and just thinking about stuff.
What's your biggest strength as a podcaster?
Oh, gosh, I've never known how to answer that question in a job interview, and I'm trying to...
I promise not to ask you what your biggest weakness is.
Well, I know this might sound a little out there, but I think my biggest strength is that in the past I have run actual marathons.
Huh.
And so I relate very well to what it means when because I've heard this more than once, that podcasting is a marathon. It's not a 5K, it's not a sprint.
Uh-huh.
And I think it makes sense to me. This is something that don't get discouraged by lower audiences, by not as much engagement as you want. You stick to it and you just keep doing it over and over.
Is there anything that you dislike about podcasting?
Definitely the technical side. Audacity is an awesome program, but for the life of me, I can't figure out why when I turn it on from day to day, it seems to give me radically different results.
That is why I abandoned Audacity.
Yeah.
To be honest, that software, it's for being a free piece of software that's available for Mac or PC. And for being fairly low learning curve in terms of the basics, that's how I started learning how to do audio editing, was on that software. And then after probably, I want to say maybe about 6 to 8 months into creating my podcast and editing in that software, I was like, that's it. I've had it. I cannot use this software anymore. It has randomly dumped projects or files on me one too many times. It has, somehow not saved my changes, or I don't know what's happening. And so my partner is a filmmaker, and he was trying to get me to use fancier software from the get-go. But every time he would open a more complex program, I would look at it and immediately panic and be like, no, I cannot. I can't do this.
Right.
And so I had a meltdown over something Audacity related. And he was like, are you ready to learn how to use Adobe Audition yet? And I was like, yes, I'm ready.
He caught you at the right time.
And I was weak.
Yeah.
But I have never looked back. I could never go back in time, but it serves its purpose. And a lot of podcasters use Audacity forever and never need to use anything else. But for me, I needed to move on.
Yeah, definitely.
What has been your podcasting highlight so far in your fairly recent career?
Well, I mentioned earlier about trying not to get discouraged about lower numbers of listeners or engagement. But, the reality is, I think we're living in an era where a podcast is the hot thing, right? Mm-hmm. We're riding the wave. And it's been encouraging the number of people that don't interact online, or I have no idea they're listening. And I just happen to bump into them and they say something that betrays the fact they've been listening.
You're like, oh.
Yeah. And it's those kind of pleasant surprises. The thing about podcasts, and I'll tell people listen to it and they'll say something like, well, I want to and I'm getting around to it. I just don't have time. I always remind them that's totally cool. A podcast is there when you want it to be there.
Yeah.
And the idea that even this moment, someone might be catching up to the first episode is, I think, kind of exhilarating.
Yeah. It always blows my mind when every single month, my first show, The Creative Impostor, I launched that in 2015, I believe. I'm bad with remembering years, but I think it was 2015, October. And it blows my mind that every month since then, there has not been a single month since then where I have not gotten downloads of episode number 1.
Wow.
And I'm just like, who, who is going back? And I think what happens is people discover a recent episode and then they think, oh, cool, I wonder how this all started. And then they go back.
Right.
It's not that they necessarily listened to all 50 whatever episodes or however many episodes are in the catalog. But I think that they do like to go back to the origin and find out how things started. So I guess it makes sense, but it still surprises me every month.
And that fact kind of makes me cringe because I'm not good by any chance, but I know I've definitely gotten slight improvement over time. There's a podcast I listen to called Philosophize This, where the guy did something I think is pretty clever, which is if you start on episode 1, which I did, he has this very quick 30-second snippet that's like, hey, it took me a while to kind of get my bearings. Why don't you skip on to episode 90 if you want something that sounds kind of professional? If you want to listen to episode 1, you enjoy it, great, more power to you. But if you're like, this guy, he doesn't sound like he has a clue what he's doing, he kind of encourages you to skip past the first couple of series. But
I will say, though, that I think there's something kind of refreshing, and maybe this is part of that whole intimacy thing that you were talking about, of people who are listening to podcasts generally are wanting to learn and grow and improve themselves in some way. And I think that they're typically an audience that they love the fact that they can go back in time. So once you're at episode 100 or whatever, they can go back in time and see how you started. And there's this certain vulnerability to that where they can see how you grew and how you improved. And it's like a way of building that relationship or that rapport and that intimacy with you as a host. I don't know. I think there's just something that's really refreshing where it doesn't have to always be 100% polished. So I don't know. I have to think about how I feel about that one.
Well, I agree with you. I guess I just wish they would have that bonding experience with someone else or not see me kind of, out there exposed and, oh, that's what the guy really sounded like. But no, I think there is great value to that. I understand what you're saying.
Have you had yet a worst podcasting moment or biggest podcasting fail?
No, I don't think I've had a moment. I think it's been more kind of a series of slow events. As I mentioned, those first 3 podcasts, they still make me cringe somewhat. And I think the biggest thing about it is I go back and listen to them. It's like, okay, audio's okay. I'm not that terrible. But I have this bad tendency, you probably picked up on it, to sort of ramble.
Okay.
And I'm trying to work on the whole, okay, here's the point I want to make, and that's the direction I'm heading. And instead, I keep going off on these little rabbit trails. And sometimes I'll go back and listen to those podcasts and realize, well, I never closed those loops. So if someone's listening, well, I really want to know why he believes that, I didn't really go back to explain it.
I think that just comes with time. Or who knows, maybe that's your style. Maybe that's your communication style and it's okay.
I could definitely use some improvement, but yeah.
What is your dream for the future with your podcast? If anything was possible, where would this take you or what would evolve?
I guess I could think about that in 2 different ways. One is where it might take me, and the other being where it might take the listeners. Because as I mentioned kind of at the end of the first podcast, the audience I'm looking for is not just anyone. It's individuals who have a deep passion, whether they realize it or not, to connect to things of value and to have a strong sense of purpose and what is the point of all this. And if I could do something to aid that person in any way, I would be thrilled. But for me personally, I mean, an opportunity to perhaps step up on the ladder of those individuals who do the sort of things I do at a higher level, and to learn from them and to be able to, even interact with them at some level would be amazing.
Do you have any advice for a new or aspiring podcaster?
The advice I'd have is probably an echo of the sort of things I'd said earlier. One is, I think there's a great deal of value I found in relating, that metaphor of podcasting as a marathon. And if you've actually run or you run a marathon, I think that makes a lot more sense. But the notion of learning, have a goal in mind, but at the same while, learning how to be excited about smaller goals that you're achieving along the way, realizing that, you're going to get burnt out if all you can focus on is, hey, I've got to get this many listeners or raise this much revenue. And I will say this, I recognize that some people get into podcasting because they're trying to expand a business, or they go into podcasting for the express purpose of selling a product. Mm-hmm. And again, more power to them. But if that's not your primary reason, like if you're going in there to share a message or something you just enjoy, be really, really careful that you don't put that revenue so high up on the pedestal that you end up getting burnt out because you're spending so much time trying to figure out how to attract sponsors or how to earn some ad revenue. Those are wonderful things, and hopefully they'll happen eventually. But I think there's been great value for me to just focus on building an excellent product, trying to expand the listener base. And those things, if they come with time, great. If they don't, well, that wasn't the purpose in the first place.
And besides listening to your show, obviously, we hope that everyone will check it out. What is your favorite way to engage with listeners and followers on social media? Do you have a favorite platform?
I use Twitter and Facebook. I mean, Saving Elephants, of course, is at first a blog. So you can find it at savingelefantsblog.com. If you don't put the blog in there, I think you find people trying to save actual elephants. I enjoy Twitter for a very peculiar reason, which is, and maybe this is just naive on my part, Twitter is above and beyond Facebook. I'll just say it, a bit of a cesspool. You'll see some of those vitriol hatred tossed back and forth.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I always get it right. Sometimes I try to be funny, or I try to be ironic, or try to be a little controversial to make a point on Twitter, but I enjoy it when I say something that's a little controversial and someone responds back to me in a way that's hateful. And I know that sounds strange, but I enjoy an opportunity because it's not about that person. It's about everyone else who's watching. And I enjoy being able to show that you don't have to respond in kind. You actually can engage that person. There's a limit to it. At some point, I'll stop talking to someone if they're just being childish. But it really is an opportunity to show we don't have to behave this way. We can choose otherwise.
Is there anything else that you want to share with our podcast Envy listeners before we say goodbye?
That's kind of like, what is your strength type question? It's a little small-minded for me, but no, just kind of a repeat. Just it's a marathon. Just stick with it. Practice makes permanent. So be careful what you're practicing and just enjoy it.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Impostor Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.